tone is for immediate...
Wait a minute. Have you heard?
This is a show to keep you on the edge of your seat.
Citizens of America,
Welcome to the Radiocast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Radiocast. I'm Adam Carrero, your host for this edition. For your newcomers, Radiocast is when the crew from ECAT, we go do a podcast and deep dive of the old-time movie and old-time TV series that we host, which is a program that we have either movie or TV show that is in the public domain, and we just decide to show it to the public in case you didn't know or didn't even know there was a different version. And today's episode of the Radiocast is a good showing of it because we have two stories that have very, very different variations of it and well known in one version or another. So we for the movie we have Casino Royale, which a lot of James Bond fans will know of, and Gulliver's Travel, which is an old folklore tale, but is made into a few different movies, and not by the same name, but today's is off that same name. The early 2000s, maybe 90s, Jack Black did his movie based off the tale, but different version of it. And today with me, it's Joe Borman and also Jack Kelleher. So both of them were technically films, but one of them was a TV movie, so that's why we had it for old-time TV. So we'll start with the one that's probably more recent, well-known, Casino Royale. James Bond, Daniel Craig starred in that movie in his series, but originally it was based off the book that led into the James Bond movies, that had this time was an American spy going in and out of British spy. But guys, your first impressions of Casino Royale?
Yeah, this is something that I had heard about because I'm a big fan of the James Bond movies. I've seen all of them, and I'd heard about this. It was kind of like one of those like fun facts where people were like, "Hey, fun fact: Sean Connery is actually not the first James Bond. It's actually, I believe, it was a Barry Nelson in the 1954 like episode adaptation of Casino Royale." So I had heard of this episode, but I'd never seen it until this show. And I've also read the book of Casino Royale, and I believe, and this kind of does follow the basic structure, not exactly the structure, because there's a lot more going on in the book versus a 50-minute TV episode. But I'd say it kind of does follow the novel, at least the bullet points, pretty well.
Yeah, Joe?
I enjoyed it. It's always cool seeing like a proto version of what became, and James Bond, like that's such a huge franchise now, like seeing like this got its start as like a made for TV movie, essentially, like the very first adaptation before it became the huge film franchise it is today. It was definitely interesting to see, like, the roots of how it could have been instead of what it became.
Yeah, it was definitely somewhat entertaining. Like, I don't know if it's because we're coming off of the Christmas time and Home Alone was constantly on, but I was like watching that and all I could think of was the gangster movie that Macaulay Culkin was watching in that movie. I'm like, this is kind of the same idea, black and white and just going on. But it was definitely, you can see some of the aspects of it that led into James Bond. Like, I've never read the book, so I really don't know how much for the book is, but like, he didn't have certain gadgets. It was basically how kind of an everyday kind of spy would be back then, just using his wits and trying to talk to his inside people and figure out who's the villain and who can he trust. And it's more of mind games and really working with gadgets, as like a lot of James Bond movies have.
Yeah, I read the book a while ago, but from what I remember, it's kind of, as you said, more of like a grounded spy sort of a cat and mouse story and doesn't have a whole lot of gadgets that the James Bond franchise is kind of famous for. Those, I believe, came in some of the later books, and then the movie series, especially the early movies, really went over the top with the gadgets. So yeah, it kind of was interesting seeing a more, especially with the budget of the TV show, had definitely more grounded. And I will say, as someone who has, of course, seen the Daniel Craig one and read the book, this is probably it definitely isn't as good as those. Because it's kind of taking like a whole novel, like condensing it down to like 45, 50 minutes. I will say a highlight of it for me was Peter Lorre as the villain, Chief. Those who have seen the Daniel Craig movie, he was played by Mads Mikkelsen. When this, he's played by Peter Lorre, who was actually in our first, a kind of a callback to our first old-time movie. He was the villain in that as well, M. And he definitely kind of played, actually, his version of Le Chiffre was actually closer to the book's take on the character than the Daniel Craig version. So it's kind of interesting to see that, because I believe this television episode aired only like 2 years after the book Casino Royale was written. So it wasn't long after. And I believe there's after this, this was the third episode of a American television anthology show called Climax, made by CBS. But after this episode was aired, CBS actually approached the James Bond author Ian Fleming about making a James Bond series, and he actually wrote several plots to episodes, but then the show was canceled. Ian Fleming actually then took a lot of those ideas, and those became the plots of several future Bond novels, including the For Your Eyes Only.
Yeah, and having the villain Laurie there, like his character, like I kind of remember, like I didn't really put a name on it at the time I was saying, but like I'm pretty sure it was Looney Tunes, but it was a cartoon version and constantly like making fun of like how he looked or how he acted. And when we first brought him in to Old Time and was doing that movie, his character wasn't like that, but this one kind of seemed like that. It was more like drawn and droopy eye, kind of like suspicious. I was like, I wonder if this is what the Looney Tunes based off, the making fun of was based off of this character, or was there other movies like that?
I think he had done roles like that before, but I was actually going to say the same thing. That's where I knew him from. Really, like growing up, like, oh, he'd be someone that they would like lampoon a lot in Looney Tunes, Merry Melodies, all those.
Yeah.
Peter Lorre was kind of one of those like a classic, like old classic Hollywood of villain actors. So he kind of definitely had a persona to him, and which we see in this episode. He kind of speaks in that voice, has a droopy appearance. Which is interesting, like because I think in M he's actually speaking. Well, he is speaking German,
right,
in M versus speaking English here. So I wonder. So it's interesting, like how speaking one language versus the other, he acts completely different.
Yeah, it could be a language thing more than a character direction that he did.
And also, kind of speaking of character direction, something that I just kind of found a little funny about this episode, about this version of Casino Royale, is that, well, as we said, that James Bond in this is American, not British, and in the end, he meets a spy called Clarence Leiter, who in the book, that character's name is Felix Leiter, and he is actually American, while in this episode he's British. So they swapped the a British spy to be American and the American spy to be British. I'm not quite sure why they did that, but they did it.
Yeah, I don't know if it was more of like a culture thing to really get viewerships. Like nowadays we would watch any kind of different secret agent kind of government. Like doesn't have to, it could be British, or like there's tons of TV shows out now that vary from country to country. But back then, I wonder if it's like, oh, people won't watch it unless he is American, and that's why they wrote it that way.
It might be something I've noticed because I've read a lot about the James Bond movies, and even though it's written by a British author and it's about a British spy, the series has always kind of been especially the movies have always been kind of very impacted by American audiences, because the Casino Royale was the first book, but it wasn't made into a movie until the 2000s with Daniel Craig. And the first one was Dr. No with Sean Connery. And the second James Bond movie ever made was called From Russia with Love. And the story behind that is, like, it was actually the fifth novel written by Ian Fleming, but it was made as a second movie because after the first one, Dr. No, came out, the president of the time, John F. Kennedy, mentioned that his favorite James Bond novel was From Russia with Love. So the studio decided to capitalize on that by making From Russia with Love the next movie. And a later James Bond movie was supposed to be titled License Revoked, but when they did that title with test audiences in America, American audiences did not like that name because it reminded them too much of the DMV and driver's licenses. And then I believe in the Daniel Craig Casino Royale, the whole thing is about a poker game, like Texas Hold'em Up. But in the novel and in this episode is a European card game called a ECAT. And I believe they changed that because American audiences do not understand how that game works. And I'll be honest, watching this episode, I had no clue how. I know there was a whole scene of him explaining how the game worked, but then like 5 minutes later, he was like doing the card game against Peter Lorre, and I was like, I've forgot everything he just said. I have no clue how this game works.
Oh yeah, that scene kind of dragged for me. The card scene and the explaining the card scene wasn't much better. Once we got past that, I really enjoyed it, but those 5 minutes really didn't translate to film too well, I didn't think.
Yeah, it wasn't a good job like when we viewed Miracle on 34th Street, that they condensed the story and it still progressed, right? This one kind of had a few little like slow spots. I even think like the scene that when the girl comes in and they had to be like, there's bugs in the room, that kind of like drew a little longer too, there instead of progressing too. That was another point in the movie. I'm like, all right, just try to blast the music and go on with it.
I think a reason why some of the scenes may have dragged is that this was actually a live broadcast.
Okay.
Yeah, like I believe the format for most of Climax's episodes was actually live, which kind of made sense because you may have noticed a few times some of the actors, especially Barry Nelson, sort of stumbled over their lines occasionally because they were doing it live. And maybe some of those drawn out scenes was so people could set up the sets next door in time for those scenes to happen on time.
Or give people enough time to like reset costumes and all that stuff.
Yeah, as someone who was in the set crew and drama club during high school, I kind of understand the need for a stalling in order for the crew to set up.
Yeah. But this was definitely like you kind of got a taste of like an American Spy, and I know with a lot of not this movie but the books of James Bond kind of led the way for American Spies, like with the Jason Bourne and the Jack Ryan that later came in decades later, but started having some connections on like the American side, but the same idea, like a James Bond style.
Oh yeah, at this point I think James Bond's almost kind of a bit of a cultural, James Bond's definitely probably one of the most influential characters in fiction.
Yeah.
Like just based on all like the parodies we've mentioned. Yeah, like Peter Lorre's been parodied a lot. Like James Bond has been parodied so many times.
Right.
Like I'm pretty sure like by this point probably every show has especially Looney Tunes, Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, just like there's references to James Bond everywhere, and it's just always kind of interesting to see like such a big franchise like that. It's always interesting to see where it begins, and it began with this hour-long TV episode.
And especially with this, like with that James Bond character, they've recasted it a few times and it still goes forward. And like they've tried the Jack Ryan character has been recast, but they don't really take it on like James Bond. Like it's always like James Bond movie and the title. Why Jack Ryan's a character, but they named all the movies after the book that was it based on. Like if it was The Hunt for Red October or Patriot Game and the two. I'm trying to think of each movie with each time they recast it, but like there's only been like one or two times that the movie has been up. Why James Bond, no matter what movie they make, the James Bond movie always picks up, and I think that's the notoriety of the character.
Yeah. It's so crazy to think, like, the timeline that we're on, that this one episode eventually led to, like, your Austin Powers and all that.
Right, yeah, parodies like that way, yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of parodies, I know you mentioned before that you actually have the Wikipedia for is it the 1967 Casino Royale? Yeah, that was a parody movie of the James Bond movies that have been made at that time, and I have not seen that movie, but I'm told it's not very good.
That's everything I've heard. Yeah, like the rights issues were really weird with James Bond, that like certain stories didn't belong to the people who did the movie franchise at first. I think they have them all now, but yeah, things were a little weird at points. That's why Sean Connery came back in the 80s with a different movie.
Yeah, gotcha. So besides James Bond, we also did Gulliver's Travel. And Gulliver's Travel was a book, 1726, a novel under the same name. And this movie came out, well, it almost didn't come out if it wasn't for Walt Disney and the Seven Dwarfs being the first cartoon movie that hit theaters and really draw it out. Paramount wasn't really willing to put this out, and then they saw how much Seven Dwarfs does, and it changed. And this was basically the second cartoon movie that came out in theaters. It did get some positive feedback, but it was kind of interesting even after Seven Dwarfs and Walt Disney, the way he shot that movie to be the first type of cartoon filmed different levels. This sort of wasn't that same way, but even Paramount just kind of saw like, oh, people want to go watch cartoons, and this kind of led the first wave of like, now we call it kids movies, but now there's a cartoon movie that comes out like several times. Well, now it's computer generated movies, but like for a while you would see like in the 90s Disney make all these cartoons, and this one was kind of a first of its kind from a different company to compete with Walt Disney.
Yeah, it's kind of odd that, as you said, this was like the second real, like, because there had been animated shorts before this,
right,
short films, but this was like the first long animated film made in America, and it's kind of interesting that you never really hear about it, because I'd watched, because when I started watching this movie, I realized that as a kid, I had actually watched this film, and I'd actually forgotten about it. So it's just kind of interesting that like the second like big studio animated film, it never really gets brought up nowadays.
No, and I don't know if that's because it's in public domain, because Paramount really didn't renew its license to keep it, and it just because it's in public domain. But it has been reproduced by several different companies to put for like VHS and DVDs. So it's not a movie that has been stuck in a vault somewhere. So people did have home copies of it.
Yeah, the studio who made it, Fleischer Studios, they're actually also the ones that did the Superman shorts from the series back in the summer. So, yeah, a lot of Fleischer stuff made into the public domain. I never saw this one before, but it definitely seems like a similar style of that, like their Betty Boop, Popeye, which I looked on the Wikipedia page. An early draft of this movie was going to star Popeye. I don't know if as Gulliver or as one of the villagers or what, but would have been fascinating to see that version as well.
Yeah, and it's, yeah, like you said, it's like coming with Superman, Betty Boop, Popeye. It's like this is their one that started it all, and it still hasn't been not so much been put on the public eye back on TV constantly, but like people don't mention it. Like it's not vocal how much like beginning of animation movies people talk about.
Yeah, because this movie does blend several different styles of animation. Because you probably noticed that the character of Gulliver and the characters of the prince and the princess are animated differently than the rest of the characters. Gulliver and what are their names? Princess Glory and Prince David. They were animated through a process called rotoscoping, whereas you film you film actual actors on sets, and then you take that film and you draw over it to match their movements, and that's why like Gulliver moves more like a real person, while everyone else is kind of moves more like cartoon characters.
Which I think they got it from Walt Disney, because Disney will do that for some of their animation. But yeah, they I don't know if that was well known back then how he did it, but between that and also like the casting wise, like the singing parts were different than actually the vocal parts too. So they had to cast. They didn't like one member cast it. They had multiple casts depending on what they had to do.
Yeah, and kind of speaking of Disney, I meant to write his name down, but like the little people who Gulliver meets, the main one, I think his name's Gabby. The person who did the voice of him, I believe, was the original voice of, it was either Pluto or Goofy from the Disney cartoons. He voiced in it. I do know, I forgot to write down which character he was, but he was like the original voice for one of like the famous Disney characters. So it's kind of interesting like that this movie was spawned by like kind of like trying to compete with Disney, yet it still had a cast member from the Disney cartoons. And I also read that I guess Walt Disney was not very impressed by this movie.
No, because I think because he had a different way of shooting how the background moved like a camera. Why this was more standstill, like the cartoons moved, but the background was still stationary. And how he set up his camera for Snow White and a couple other animated movies that they did, the background kind of moved almost like the camera. I think that's the way he set up. So I think he thought like, I think the way he shot it should be the new way of doing these type of movies. So when somebody doesn't either had the money, the budget to have that equipment, or just didn't do that way, he was just like, it's all right, it's a cartoon.
Yeah, you mentioned that the background doesn't really move a whole lot in this movie, and that may be because I did read that the production of it was a bit rushed by Paramount because they really wanted to get a film out to compete with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So the Fleischers kind of had to rush to get this movie out in time for their deadline.
Yeah, and the way it was, like cartoons were drawn there, they just do the still frame movement kind of drawings too, so it wasn't kind of upgraded like now with computers and that. It's very easily just keep going.
Oh yeah, it's kind of crazy thinking to compare the two movies together, because it's a good movie, Gulliver's Travel, but like Snow White production wise is like a level higher than it, I would say. So I can see where Disney's criticisms are in it. Like still a good level, but it seems like it's essentially like the same level as the shorts that they were already doing at the time.
Yeah. And it could be like back then too, Disney didn't have their art department like they do now, where they have an art school and that. So really Disney could have just found the right guys at the right time to go with them. And then you had the two brothers here just trying to do it on their own and start something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, something that I just kind of found funny about a movie called Gulliver's Travels, that he spends about half the movie unconscious. I just wanted to mention that because I timed it out. The movie is only 76 minutes long. Gulliver doesn't wake up until 38 minutes into the movie. So he is asleep for half the film. I'm pretty sure like a quarter of the film was just them constructing that big ramp to bring him to the Capitol.
To tie him down. Yeah, and I don't think you ever find out like where like where he was going. He was just like shipwrecked, and somehow he found this little island, and then he's just like, all right, I'm gone.
Well, I know the book plot, like it's a big thing of like him going to the village of small people, and then I think he eventually makes it to a village of giants. So I don't know if they were trying to set up a sequel back then, like, oh, we'll do it completely again, but, reuse Gulliver, completely new thing, and just never happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading that this was one, because it's called Gulliver's Travels, plural. In the book, he travels to several different fantastical lands. As you mentioned, he goes to the place where he finds a bunch of little people and he's a giant. Then he goes to a land where he's the little person and there are giants much, much bigger than him. Then I believe he goes to a land with floating cities, and then to an island populated by talking horses, who are the dominant species of that land, and humans are sort of their cattle animals.
That was interesting.
It gets a little weird. It gets weird.
I was gonna say, I want the horse movie now.
Yeah. Now it probably would make sense. Back then it would be like, why am I watching a cartoon of horses talk to people? Now after like Mr. Ed, they're like, yeah, we could probably make that movie pretty good.
Yeah, and I was reading about sort of the casting. Like I mentioned some of the voice actors for this. The actor who played Gulliver's name was Sam Parker. Ironically, he was also a sailor in real life. Like Gulliver, he was actually in the Navy. He was a quartermaster who eventually became a radio station. Who eventually became a speaker at a radio station, and he actually won the role for this movie in a radio contest. And I believe he did the mocap. No, not the mocap. The rotoscope. It was either him or he either did some of the rotoscoping or they brought in someone else.
Oh, gotcha.
Like to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was the voice actor. And also something I just noticed that something I just kind of found funny about this movie is Gulliver has, much like Santa Claus and Santa Claus Conquers the Martian, nothing really phases Gulliver in this movie. He wakes up in this land, there's a bunch of tiny people, and he's very chill about the whole thing.
He doesn't start like screaming at people,
like he's not like what? It's not like, where the hell am I? It's just kind of like, oh, this is fun. Oh, isn't this cute?
Just my all the time.
I'll help you and I'll do this. Not like just wondering how these little people got him down and everything else. But it's definitely I think it is a very good kids movie. Like I think kids could watch it and get a concept of like the interactions of like it doesn't make sense, but could understand like being nice and get the whole concept of Gulliver's and the little town people. Even though the king was kind of full of himself and they just kind of didn't emphasize that, just like yeah,
I read that in the book. The two kingdoms, there's a Lilliput, which is the kingdom where Gulliver washes up, and then there's the other one, a Blefuscu.
Yeah,
I'm probably not pronouncing that right. The author based those two lands off Great Britain and France, and it was kind of meant to parody the rivalry between those two kingdoms, about how because in the movie they basically get into a war over a disagreement about which song is going to play at a wedding. So the author just kind of wanted to parody the like constant back and forth between Great Britain and France.
Yeah, and back then they had those kind of issues, but yeah, I think both movies were something interesting to bring up to our show for the public and to kind of emphasize on like some of the stuff that later in the future led into other movies, and you can see it cultural wise that it just continues to be known of. So our time is wrapping up. So I'd like to thank Joe and Jack for being on this episode, and make sure you catch other Radiocast episodes and our old-time movie and old-time TV show on ECAT. And if you miss any, just make sure you go to our YouTube channel, Easton Cat TV, with the TV being the capital letters, and check us out. So hope you enjoyed the show and catch us around. Have a good day.